This is Axis and Allies North Africa How to Play-ish on the 2 or Less channel. Before we get going, may I mention that I make these videos in aid of a charity called Cure Parkinson's. You can guess what they're trying to do. There is a link to them below this video, one in the About section on the channel page. If you happen to have a spare dollar, euro, yen, yak or British pound you can send to them, I'm sure they'd appreciate it. So the reason why this is an How to Play-ish video is because the game itself, the heart of this game, is still regular Axis and Allies. There are a number of rule changes in there, but if you're familiar with Axis and Allies, and I'm assuming that you are, you already know the principles of how to play this game. However, the rulebook, unlike other campaign games, your Guadalcanal, D-Day and Battle of the Bulge, this rulebook doesn't hold your hand like those ones do. And I'm hesitating to use the word legalistic jargon. It's not that at all. It's miles off from that. But there are some wordings in there that did confuse me at the time when I started reading for the rulebook. As I, for instance, say with your blitz move, we used to blitz in the global game and so on and so forth. Tanks move 2 spaces, blah blah blah. But the way it's written in this book, it adds an extra layer to it, simply because of there's land mines in there and sea mines as well. And the way they're trying to cover off a couple of caveats did lead to a little bit of confusion with the way it's written. Also, movement points, and you have to save a movement point for an attack declaration. It does seem more complicated than it actually is, and then when you've played through 1 or 2 rounds, things drop into place really, really quickly. So I won't be covering an ABC step by step for the whole thing. I think you're pretty good enough to know how to play the game anyway, and the rulebook itself gives you plenty enough information, but I hope to be covering the major trip hazards and points that caught me out early doors when playing this game. But what I suggest you do is you check down in the comments below this video in case I've missed something important, or I've misexplained something or misunderstood something entirely, then I'll get berated in the comments below. So just double check them to make sure that I've got things right before I lead you down the wrong path. So let's get started looking at the board and looking at the pre-turn 1 phase. And I'll be referring to the start of this game as turn 1 because there are 2 scenarios. One can start on turn 1, one can start on turn number 7, but I'll be specifically thinking about turn number 1 as the start of the game, and we're looking at pre-turn 1. So straight off the bat, 3 important things to do. First is your extra bag or your bag of extra pieces. Don't open those up just yet. They are extra pieces that come into additional scenarios that you might want to make. They don't come into the base game at all, so keep those to one side. The second thing to notice is that we've got some land units, some sea units and some air units and some tokens. With tokens, you cannot put chips underneath them. With sea and air, you can't chip those either. You can only chip up your land units. Just remember that going forward in this game. The third thing that I mentioned is up there on the turn track and the information panels that are up there. Information panels tell you about the basic reinforcement points that the 4 powers get. United States don't come into this game at the start. They don't come in until turn number 7, a long way off. So if you're a United States player, put your feet up, put the kettle on, make us a nice cup of tea. There's a phase sequence up here, tells you how the phases roll through. Absolutely obvious. But on your turn track, you can put your marker down to follow the turn track. So it tells you you're starting off here. It tells you on here that there are 2 Sherman tanks. The Brits will get those on turn number 4. They come into their Atlantic Ocean convoy when we get around to them. So put those up there so the Brits can't purchase them. Also, you put 1 Italian and 1 German truck on the turn 7 space. A little truck symbol tells you that this is what happens when they get there. They say leave them aside, but put them up there so you don't forget them and you don't actually mistakenly use them. They come in only on turn number 7. Before that, the Axis forces only get 1 truck each available to them. And just to highlight this section separately, going back to the units you can or can't chip up, your type of transport trucks that you use in this game, each power's got a certain number of them, but You cannot chip your trucks either. I'm keeping that separate so you don't make the mistake of chipping up, because they are land units, but they don't fall into this same category of land combat units. Also, when they are captured, or if they are captured by one of the opposing powers, there are different rules to how you deal with it, whether you actually put a token on a truck or whether you chuck them in the bin and grab one in exchange if you've got them. Those are very clearly written on page 19 in the blue panel at the bottom of that. It's probably best if I point things out to you where you can find the information for yourselves at the appropriate times, rather than trying to remember everything that happens way down the line. So as I mentioned, we are starting off on pre-turn 1, and we'll look at the board and a couple of important places to note. Now, on turn number 1 to turn number 7, this white line here, separating these two halves of the board, separate two halves of the game effectively. The Axis and Allied forces use this half of the board, they don't cross this white line. When you get into turn number 7, then things happen. The scenario instructions, which are towards the back of the book, tell you what you can and can't do on turns number 4 for grabbing your tanks, number 7 for introducing the extra units and this extra half of the board when the Americans and the French really come into play themselves. Pre-turn 1, the UK have this unique setup ability for them, and I really like this idea. Rather than being able to just put your pieces down where you're told to put them on your setup cards, the Brits get this one that says, in the Suez Canal Convoy Zone, Indian Ocean Convoy Zone and the Atlantic Ocean Convoy Zone, they have variable initial replacements up to the value of 12 replacement points. That means the UK player may elect to obviously put 12 points worth of replacements in, but do they put points in that are more Navy based, more air based, more land based? Are they more attacking based, or is the idea for a defensive mode early on in the game? It's a really cracking idea. Now, I'll point out to you straight away as well that these are the Navy deployment zones. There's 5 of them on the board, but we come to that in a minute, a little bit in more depth. When the Brits get to do their initial variable replacements, they don't have to place Navy into this zone. They could place them into these other zones as well, which advance the deployed units through the board onto Cairo or through the gap of the Suez Canal and into the sea zone number 31. Looking more at the board now, as you have seen possibly there are these little air-based tokens. These aren't part of the base game. You do not get air-based tokens in here, but I stick mine on, my little custom-made ones that I use in the G40 and other global size versions of the game, to highlight control. You can only control a territory that has one of these RP values. You can't control Mercer Brega because it hasn't got a IPC, that's going to be a habit for to break, a replacement points value. Also, you cannot land your planes in areas that do not have a replacement point value. So as when you're planning out your massive attacks with your air wings coming over and trying to find a safe landing point for them, if you've got a lump of units in these places, you sometimes might not realise you haven't got a landing space. So these are just for me to highlight the landing situations and the ownership of these places. If we look again at the board, we've got this coast road running through. Certain units have an ability to utilise the coast road to move 5 spaces in the non-combat phase. If we just nip over to the side, we're not using early doors. You have the Sahara Desert. It runs right across the board in this lighter colour, and it's numbered with letters A, B and C rather than with names. And simply with the Sahara Desert, only your scout cars can attack into or operate in these areas. You can't fire from a tank. You can't fly your planes into here. It's only the scout cars that can operate and attack into these Sahara Desert areas. And just talking about coast roads on the second half of the board, you'll notice that Spanish Morocco there is hatched out. It's one of those areas you can't go into. And because the coast road goes through there, you can't use the coast road for its boosted movement.
Americans, when they eventually land in turn number 7, will come through to Casablanca and got to walk their way through this region of Fez into Iran before they can get back on and get their faster movements going again. If we look at the board now, rather from a naval point of view, some areas have got hard roundels, some have ghosted roundels. The ghosted roundels will get put on as hard roundels, provided the power that roundels are here are in this area and are controlling power in here. So obviously into Tripoli, if the Italians start off and grab this area for themselves because there's no one in opposition, this convoy zone is what's known as open. So you put both powers roundels on there that are the Axis forces. If the Brits came through and took Tripoli, these would be removed. The convoy zone is now closed, but Britain would not put their roundels on there and could not use that convoy zone for themselves. It's either open or it's closed. It's a binary case, for want of a better explanation. These areas here, as I did mention before, and I'll highlight it for a second time, because they have no replacement point value, that could not be controlled by Italy. It couldn't be controlled by Germany or anybody else. You can't control an area that doesn't have a replacement points value. Now, aside from the replacement points that are valued in these places with the numbers, we've also got a stack limit. Tripoli has a stack limit of 12, Mareth has 10, Alagira has 10. There's various different numbers here. If there's no replacement point value put in there, these ones without a stack limit value are stack limits of 8 units. Stack limits are the 8 combat units that are in there. If a plane is flying over there, it's not part of it. Also, trucks and supplies do not count towards the stack limit of an area. The small exception, and it's only a very small exception, is Malta up here, a very important place for the Brits in WW2, and it's worth 15 replacement points. It's got a stack limit of 3, but you can only stack 3 supplies in there as well. So the Brits have to work hard at keeping this place supplied, because if they want to gain the 15 replacement points from there, they must spend 1 supply point per turn to grab that 15 replacement points. It's an important place. It's homage to the very important role that Malta played back in those days. Now, there are a few more areas on the board here. We've got Italy up the top there and Gibraltar over there. They are what's known as staging places for the powers. America don't get a staging place, nor do France. The importance of staging places was slightly lost on me. Gibraltar has a stack limit of 2, and early doors I couldn't see a reason at all for why there's a stack limit there at all of 2 and what the importance was. It did become more apparent and very useful later on. Those 2 points of stack limit were vital, I would say. To go along with those special staging places of Gibraltar and Italy, there are a few more rules regarding Sardinia and Crete and Cyprus. These guys here with the hard rounders on them. I'd suggest that you look up those at the time when it's important under staging places and deployment places. Again, I don't want to bombard you with too much information that you won't use very often, and we'll just get lost in the whole melee in your mind if we get too much confusion going off there. So we finished off this vague overview. It's a vague overview with a couple of things to point out going back to those deployment zones for the Navy units. Now, reinforcements go into the reinforcement zones before they go onto the board. It's just a big collective area for you to shove your pieces down while still counting things up, and before they come onto the board later on in the game, because it's an effective purchase and repair phase from the old sort of school way of playing things, and they then go onto the board later on. But there are some exceptions to that. Over on the British one, we did look at that slightly earlier. Your British Navy pieces will only go into the Atlantic Convoy Zone in there where it's marked up with your ships. They can only go into there, not into these spaces. But they may also, let's move you, they may also go into Sea Zone number 3 as well, where they're figured up on there. The Italians have Sea Zone number 10 off of Italy to put its Navy units into when it deploys them. And the Americans have Sea Zone number 2, and the Germans have Sea Zone number 1. There is a special case for when you're deploying your German submarines. As I said to you, on your purchasing, you put your units into the reinforcement zone. They come onto the board later, except for German submarines. They go straight onto the board in Sea Zone number 1, and they can be used in that immediate round when it's combats and non-combat movements, etc. It's a way of giving Germany a surprise strike with those units of war. There are a few more things just to point out again before we get really deep into this that do not go into the reinforcement zone when they are purchased. They are landmines and sea mines. Landmines double-sided, there's a 2 landmine there or a single landmine there, and there are sea mines for both powers of each side, Britain and America on one side of this one, who will control that particular mine and detonate them at the appropriate time. And remember, there are a couple of times when the landmines could be detonated, and there are 3 times, I believe it is, when the sea mines can be detonated, depending on who's moving in and out of sea zones and or land zones. But when they are purchased by the purchasing power, they go onto the board immediately. Now we are on phase 1 advanced convoys. We will talk about deployment into these convoy zones and combat within the convoy zones later on. But just for now, we're going to say we've got a number of units in this Tripoli convoy zone. We stick them in there like that. We will say that the convoy zone is open because Germany control Tripoli. When it comes to the advanced convoys stage of it, the guys that are in there that are still alive advance onto the board. Also, at that point in time, any kind of cover, air cover for these guys that are in there can also land 2 spaces away wherever they want to in a controlled area that is friendly to them. If that unit happened to be in that convoy zone as part of your purchases, it would still be eligible as a combat unit to defend those guys in there. More of that though later on. The Brits are the exception because the Brits are exceptional. With this triple convoy route that's down here for them. It represents the units coming down from Britain, going right around the bottom of Africa via the Atlantic Ocean, into the Indian Ocean, back up through the Suez Canal, and then can come on board in Cairo. Stuff in here can't be attacked. You can't put your sea mines in here. You can't put actually opposition sea mines in Sea Zone 31 either, so the Brits can repair their battleship should it be damaged in Sea Zone 31, spending 1 supply point. Just flipping around like a flippy thing who flips, you cannot put sea mines in a opposition's deployment zone, naval deployment zone anyway, but we might mention that again later on when we come to a full mines explanation. But going back to the Brits for the advanced convoy section of it, units that are in the Suez Canal move into Cairo, Indian Ocean convoy moves forward, guess what? Atlantic Ocean moves into the Indian Ocean. It slows down the advance for the Brits. But it also means that Brits have to think 3 steps ahead of themselves all the time. It's a jigsaw puzzle where you have all the right pieces, not necessarily in the right order. Now, hopefully, for clarity here, if Germany had units in the Tripoli convoy zone and Benghazi Sea Zone is not open, they can't land them in Benghazi, obviously. If the Benghazi Sea Zone was open because Germany controlled Benghazi, It would not matter if there are opposing ships in the way, that convoy zone still services the Benghazi port. It would not matter if there are opposition ships in the Benghazi Sea Zone. It is still able to service that port with their units. And just to tidy up the end of the advanced convoy stage, these pieces will get placed in there at the end of the German turn. Should the Brits come through and take Tripoli, then this convoy zone is now closed. These units that are bobbing along in the water must go back into the reinforcement zone to be deployed at a later stage in the game. So while we're here looking now at requisitioning your forces, getting your bits and pieces on the board, it's simple and obvious really. You've got your values of your territories that will add to your base number. Your base number is up there. Germany starts off, it's pointing different place, is up there. Germany starts off with 25 replacement points. Thus far, they don't get many more than that in my games, but once they start getting into Tunis and Mareth and the Kasserine path, then numbers start to increase for the Axis forces. So with a simple overview of requisitioning your reinforcement units, Germany say have 25 reinforcement points to play with. The values of the units are on the reference cards. Germany spend their 25 worth of units and they put them into the reinforcement zones as we've seen before, except obviously the submarines that go into Sea Zone number 1 and the land and sea mines. The sea mines can go into any place, except if there's any hostile ships in there and except if it's going to be one of the reinforcement zones for placing naval units. They just pop them in there. Germany would own that sea mine. Germany can explode it or detonate it at certain points in time. And they are land mines. Similar to the sea mines, you are limited to placing one per territory per turn. So if you had bought yourself 2 or 3 land mines, you could put them into 2 or 3 separate territories. There's no limit to the amount you can put into the territories apart from that token limit, which again we can't chip up the cardboard tokens. Germany could put a mine into here because they've got a combat unit in there. Germany could put it one into here because they've got a combat unit and ownership, and they could put it into one they just control themselves. When it comes to the mine being detonated, if you've got your guys in there, if you control it, then you set them off with a big kaboom. We'll probably look at that later on if I remember. So we move on to the combat move and attack declaration phase 3. Now I'm trying to keep the board as much free of clutter as I can and the explanation as much free of clutter as I can, but I'm going to jump back just one stage for you. This 5 token of supplies that's in this area here can be broken down into 5 ones. If it was in a sea zone bobbing around in the water, because it's being brought in as a supply in one of those convoy zones, it can be broken down into 5 ones. If it's in one of its staging areas, like say Gibraltar over there, you can break it down. It's a big warehouse. You're warehousing things over there in Gibraltar, same as you would be doing in Italy. However, if those 5 token of supplies are in the reinforcement zone, you cannot break it down. You bought in bulk, one big lump. It costs you 3 replacement points to buy 5 supplies, 1 replacement point for 1 supply. It's economy of scale in terms of the purchasing powers that be. So looking at this combat movement again. Now there's a couple of things which come up, and we go into individual units in a minute, but there are movement points. Again, as I mentioned earlier on in this video, some of the jargon that they've used, it isn't horrible jargon, it's not terrible words, but it adds a layer of confusion when you first read it. When you read it a second time, it does become clear. In regards to the way this game is played, rather than the old style Axis and Allies, move your guys in, have an attack. No, you attack from an adjacent area. Things have 1 movement point, things have 2 movement points. There's 1 type of unit with 3 points and 1 type of unit with 4 movement points. Those ones with the larger points are tied in with special abilities. Generally speaking, it's old style A&A. It's one movement point for your infantry and your artillery, etc. As I mentioned to you, when it comes to tanks and the blitzing ability and their 2 movement points, it's not muddy, it's just the way probably I read it. But the way it's written in the book is you have to spend one of your points on an attack declaration. These guys say, we are attacking into here. These guys say, we're attacking into there. That is their movement point allowance been used up. If the Tankens were back here in Mercer-Brega, they could use one movement point into there, and the second movement point is the attack declaration into there. It's really just 2 movement points into there. Now when you bring your aircraft into attack, it's again standard Axis and Allies rules that your fighters fly in 4 places, your bombers fight in 6 places, apart from the German Stukas. These only fly 4 spaces as well, but they are absolutely great units for their special abilities. Again, more on that later. It would fly in from Alagira 1, 2, 3 and demonstrate a landing space in Benghazi for this attack. When it comes to the attack, you have your anti-aircraft guns firing up, no problem at all with that. The tanks could move in and the Brits could explode their mines. They can explode any, some or none, it's up to them. They choose to detonate their mines. Now it's an odd concept about you choose that the opposition walked into your mines, but just as an infantry unit doesn't represent one infantry guy, one tank isn't one tank, it's a commitment to that type of effort in combat. The way I view that the mines are, that they're not an actual physical landmine, it's a commitment to that type of covert, shadowy world type of operations that the Brits have put into there for using their mines, that they choose to detonate them if and when the Germans come through. And they can choose to do as many as they want during that combat. However, as a general point within the game, you must use a supply to get your guys to go in with an attack. You must use one supply for up to 5 of your combat units that need those supplies. Certain units don't need those supplies and would get changed around in the countings. So these guys spend their supply to come in here to an attack with. Guys from this territory, they spend their supply as well. Theirs is flipped the other side because they are flanking units. As it says here, re-rolls. They re-roll any 8 pluses. Infantry, naked running in, hit on a 2. But if they go an 8 plus, they can re-roll and they can re-roll their re-rolls should they fail. If you had 6 guys going into this attack, they'd have to spend 2 supplies to do that. You could choose to leave some guys behind and not make that attack and just use the guys up to the value of the supplies that you've got. From the Brits' point of view, they would themselves need to spend their supply to defend. There are certain units that don't need supplies to defend. There are certain units that don't need supplies to attack. But they are again are special cases. We come to those in a moment. The Brits would spend their supply to defend, or they'd have to retreat. The supply could come from the area that they're in or an adjacent area. Same as the guys attacking could spend it from the area they're in or an adjacent area with supplies that they are in control of or are available to them. And as a defender, you don't have to stand and fight. You can elect to not pay one of your available supplies and back out of the fight. We're not going to do it in this case, but it is an option available to you in the step 1 of the combat phase. After the first round of attack, this supply is then removed, and we say that nothing actually happened here. This supply has been spent, and this supply has been spent. These guys have got to spend again if they want to continue their attack. Brits having no supplies in here and no self-sufficient units would have to retreat. The attacking player could then advance into this area. Now notice for this area, this has got a special bonus in it. Land defenders re-roll 9s and 10s, a bit like the flanking units could re-roll the 8 pluses. Over in Mareth, which we're not dealing with at this stage because it's turn 7 onwards when we get into Mareth, the infantry get a +1 when they're defending versus attacks from Tripoli. It's small little things to notice on the board and to remember at the time. but the attacks are just basic Axis and Allies roles. Bang bang, pop pop, you're dead, I'm not, provided you can fund the attacks and the defence with your supplies. Now, there was a question answered for me by Matt Hyra, the designer of this game, regarding the air movement into these places with your stack limits when you're actually at the stack limits. The plane, as we mentioned before, goes 1, 2, 3. I can demonstrate that as a legal landing spot, despite the fact that it is already at its stack limit of 10. It is safe to assume for the attacking player that this attack will be successful, or if unsuccessful and units get destroyed and they can't continue with that attack, there will be enough units destroyed to make that as a legal landing spot. It has happened to me before on an attack not quite the same as this, a few more units were involved, but when the Brits chose to detonate their mines, they roll 3 dice at 3. They scored 5 out of the 6 hits, and the Germans were devastated, running home for beer and pretzels. I shouldn't wonder. So without extrapolating any extraordinary cases to the nth degree, we would say that the Brits lost their units or were forced to retreat without having supplies to supply them in their defence. The mines are exploded, they are removed from the game, and the German units can move in up to the stack limit of each of the territories that they go into. It's fairly obvious, fairly easy to follow. I wouldn't want to say to you, just read the rule book, but so much of it is regularly Axis and Allies and regularly in the rule books, easy to find stuff. Their movement into there will be in the conclude combat phase for these land units. We'll look at the combat phase in the naval battles because it gets slightly more twisted, shall we say. So regular naval movement rules follow on from exactly what you'd expect from regular Axis and Allies. Apart from the distances, they move 4 spaces rather than 2 spaces. It's what you'd expect in a smaller theatre. We can move things through faster. Things you have to understand is that the mines that have been deployed into a non-hostile zone can be detonated by the power that controls them. So if the Brits wanted to go through from Sea Zone 22 into Sea Zone 14, if they got into that area first, Germany could decide to detonate that mine. If it was unsuccessful, these guys can move forward again from there. The land mines that I said to you roll 3 dice at 3, sea mines roll 1 dice at 3. Yeah, they're not a good hit, but when they do, it leaves you crying. I can promise you that. However, if you're moving into a combat zone like this, the same rules would apply. Let's just remove the clutter, remove the mine from the board just for the moment here. The Benghazi Convoy Zone is open because Germany, or it could be Italy, control Benghazi. This place is available as a convoy zone with which to deploy Axis units into this place. On the Brits' combat move and attack declaration phase, they can move in there, avoiding a mine or detonating the mine, whatever happens here. It's going to be a battle takes place. There's a couple of important things to highlight straight away. The supplies here are German supplies. That's why they're on the German roundel rather than the Italian roundel. It's important for when they get moved off of there later on in the deploy reinforcements and assign convoy escorts phase, phase 6. There was always long words, long descriptions for their phases in this game. So when you get to your naval battles again, standard rules apply. That the air can't hit submarines, submarines can't hit air. Usual exceptions apply to that with the destroyers cancelling submarines' abilities, first strikes, etc. Ignoring first strikes, etc. for this demonstration purposes, the first thing to remember that subs can't hit air, so the submarine attacks going into there could go on to the non-existent fantasy transport ships. All these units that have been deployed into here are on transport vessels. I completely understand why they haven't put transport vessels into this game. It's not Renegade nickel and diming you. Quite simply, the units that are deployed into this zone have been flown in from Stuttgart or from Eindhoven or whatever it is. They've appeared in this sea zone. If you had a game mechanic built into this game that requires you to start putting transports on the board and bringing those down, etc., it slows down what is a very, very nicely paced game. If you had just to make your transports appear in Benghazi with these units, it adds clutter to the sea zone. Then you remove them at the end of the combat phase or end of the turn when you've deployed them back into your regions. So having no transport ships makes perfect sense to me. At the end of each round of combat that occurs in a convoy zone, 2 units at the defender's behest can be removed from the combat. It stays within the sea zone, it stays within the fight, within the melee, but you can remove 2 units. It represents 2 units that are on one of the convoying transporting boats. Now, in this case, if Germany have been attacked and nothing's happened, there's been no damage done to either of their defending aircraft, or the submarine has managed to miss its role versus the transport ships, Germany would probably want to get their supplies and one of their tanks, the Halautsky. They just move them somewhere obvious and somewhere out of the way. At the end of every combat round, the defending player can do that. If there were attacking players' transport ships in a convoy zone with their deployed units, they don't get involved in the battle at all. It's only the defending transport ships that are vulnerable at this moment in time. When it comes to the damage being done, should the submarine that can't hit the planes hit one of these transport ships, there is a priority for what and when the units are removed. Now, I'll read the priority to you straight from the manual because it's different for different types of combat within these sea zones. When transports are taken as casualties, each hit immediately destroys 2 reinforcement land units, which can include trucks. The first is freely chosen by the defender. The second, you select, the you being the attacker. So the defender chooses one unit to remove from the game as being destroyed, and the attacker chooses a second unit. Now, I've highlighted that part because when there's mine detonation, because should you deploy your units into a zone with mines, because mines could have been put in there if there were no Axis forces in there. Over on page 27, it says each hit destroys 2 newly deployed reinforcement land units. The first is freely chosen by the acting player. For the second, the mine token's owner selects the unit. Now, just read those 2 different paragraphs when you come to doing combat, and it will drop into place. It's page 27 for the mines and page 21 for the combat losses. So let's just say that something happened here and the choice went for the defender first and then the attacker. Dink, dink, dink. 2 units get destroyed, removed from the board. After that round of combat, 2 more units, 1 transporting ship's worth of reinforcements, can now escape the combat as well. Germany would choose these 2 guys to escape from the combat. Then on a subsequent rounds of combat, again, units would fire, units would defend, some may or may not be lost, and stuff that survives can again escape the combat. But if those defending combat units by Germany have been lost, and those units have already escaped, you can't attack them. They will just sit in the water until it comes around to their advanced convoy stage, where they will move from Benghazi convoy into Benghazi port. And once again, I will say it's not a really good. This is how you play video if I tell you to read the rules. But again, it's things that will happen once in a while, and it will drop into place very quickly. when you do things on the board. I'm not very good at learning a game just by reading rules. I have to get the pieces on the board myself, and I'm sure that you will benefit from reading the rules along with some of the information I'm giving you here. So after you've made all of your combats and attacks have all been done, we say everything's been tidied up, we can move on to the non-combat movement phase. You're not going to be surprised at anything that happens in non-combat movement phase. Your trucks can pick up to 6 units and shift them around 5 spaces along the coast road. But once your trucks have picked up and anywhere en route, things can't move before they're picked up, things can't move after they've been dropped off. But once that truck drops off, it is then frozen in that space until the next non-combat movement phase. Okay, let's look briefly at the phase 6, deploy reinforcements and assign convoy escorts. And I say briefly because it's fairly obvious for most of those things that go into there. We've got our Tripoli Sea Zone. We have our Tripoli Convoy Zone, rather, that's available to the Italians because they own Tripoli, or an Axis power control Tripoli. They can put their units straight into there. They go bobbing along in the water. Any planes that they bought can act as escorts now because they are in that region. The ship that they've also purchased for Italy doesn't go into this sea zone, it goes into the deployment zone up there in zone number 10, where Italy deploy their naval units. The supplies that cannot be split down in the reinforcement zone, they go into the sea zone as well. However, Britain, because there was no combat navy vessels in there opposing them, could put a mine in there. If you put a mine in there, the mine could be detonated, and again, as I mentioned before with the naval mines being detonated, there can be some casualties from there. Just be aware of that. Also be aware that if you're trying to place a German submarine at this stage, you should have done that in phase number 2, as we mentioned with Germany getting their surprise deployment of their surprise strike unit. During phase 6, also, an air unit that is on an in-range base 2 spaces away can now move and go into the convoy zone to act as an extra defender that's in there. It could not do that if it had moved in the combat phase or in the non-combat phase. Provided it has been stationary, it can fly 2 spaces and help protect those units coming onto the board. Let's now move on to the one area that I think, I wouldn't say confused me the most, but led to the most amount of reading time that I had to put into this. And again, you want to get those units onto the board, you want to see how they work in action rather than just relying on memory for them. And those units being anything written on this chart here, or anything written on the opposite side of this chart. Now, this chart isn't the one that comes with the game. The one that comes with the game is made on thicker cardboard and it's a bit shiny. A matte laminate helps me out just a little bit with my old mince pies. But all these units here, they've all got these special unit characteristics. When you first read them, or when I first read them, it confused me because some are self-sufficient, some are not self-sufficient. We've got things that can do coast road movement, hit and run, long range patrol, etc, etc, etc. It's really too simple for me to say just read them, just use them. But once you do just read and just use them, you start to learn how valuable they can be. So we'll start off with a couple of my favourite units to use for this, which are the German anti-tank gun and the Stuka dive bomber. The anti-tank gun can be used as air defence. It can fire as an air defensive unit before the attack takes place, because they're only defending units when they're anti-aircraft guns. If they fire in that phase, they may also fire in defence against units coming into it. Anti-tank guns and the Brits have some of those too, during the first round of combat, you may use their hits to target the opposing tanks. I've got the Stuka here as well. This may target its attack in any round of its attack phase. There are some units capable of blitz moves, and just be careful that if a mine forces them to retreat, then the unit they're blitzing with may still carry on. But there are also units that are capable of having coast road movement and long range movement, which is not the same as blitz at all. Coast road movement, I mentioned, is 5 spaces in the non-com phase. Units like these scout cars, those are the ones that the Germans have. The British ones, the UK ones, they are very, very, very small. I mounted these on small pieces of plastic. I think these were mines from a Table Tactics edition. They're mounted on a piece of blue tack stuck on there because I think if you sneeze, you're going to lose them. But the scout cars have many different abilities. One of the great little features, they don't roll at a particularly high number, but when they work, they can be used to target air units. So again, if you've got your Stukas, you've got your anti-tank guns, and you've got your scout cars, remember to roll your dice separately during the combat phase for each of those units. The other thing that the scout cars can do when they make their attacks, it doesn't cost them one of the supplies. Scout cars must retreat after the first round of combat because the scout cars have what's known as hit and run. They make one attack and they get the hell out ski quick. And that attack again could be targeting one of those planes with their target air unit's abilities. Because of their various extra movement points that they have, the British ones have 4 movement points on the chart, just double checking myself here, and the German scout cars have 3 movement points. Remember that 1 point has to be used in your attack declaration. So say this truck came from in here, it would use 1 point to move in, 1 point to declare an attack on this region of Sirte. It would then have to retreat after that first round of attack, even though it didn't play a supply for it or wasn't included in the whole general supply numbers. But afterwards, because it has long-range patrol, it can use its remaining single point to move into here in the non-combat phase, provided this was already taken by some of these combat units. It couldn't go in there in a combat move, which would only happen during the combat phase. I think I've explained that clear enough. If not, then sack me. The other thing that the scout cars can do, and again, there's multiple things they can do. It's one of the fattest notations on this sheet here. Something which is called Supply Raider, which again, you read it in the book. It's very, very simple. Before the first round of combat, they can go into an area and raid one of the supplies. It can be really handy if you're planning an attack against a number of units here with limited supplies. You can force them to retreat from the region, giving them no option to spend that supply on defence. The only other thing which I haven't mentioned before with the bombers that come into it, I just wanted to get that separate with their remembering to roll their dice separately, is bombers have what's called collateral damage. When you stick your bombers into a region, immediately before you roll any dice on the first round of combat, the attacking bomber may choose to destroy a supply token. Regardless of the number of bombers that are attacking, you can take one of them away. There's small caveats for if there is no combat in that territory, but again, I'm going to say it again, read the rules yourself because you're not going to remember all this information being thrown at you all at once, but it's giving you an awareness of the capabilities, and I would suggest that this sheet is your Bible, your go-to sheet. It tells you the cost of supplies, how many can be purchased by a power in the round, attack and defence, and so on and so forth. I had a lot of fun choosing a unit, nipping it round the edge, destroying a supply from somebody else, and seeing how that affected combat in the games I've played thus far. So, one moment.
So I hope I've given you enough basic information for you to roll forward with this game. I hope I haven't made any mistakes. I apologise if I've made any mistakes, and if I've had any massive omissions, then please point them out in the comments below to help me and other players out in the future. But just remember that I think that this player aid, double-sided player aid, 2 come in the box for each side to use. It is your Bible. It really is your Bible, and the references in there to shove you back into the rulebook to double check what you're reading. Initially, in the first couple of games, you're going to be going to that rulebook 3 or 4 times every 10 minutes, but it does click into place really quickly. And as a quickie overview of this game, I'm loving it. I am absolutely loving it. I really enjoy playing Battle of the Bulge, although I think I mentioned before, I do go to D-Day as my go-to campaign game, even though I think Battle of the Bulge is the better game. This one, and I'm not getting paid by Renegade, I'm not a Renegade fanboy, I'm Axis and Allies fanboy for sure. This trumps them. This is a really interesting game, especially for the Brits, for that little jigsaw puzzle they got at the start. They got all the right pieces, not necessarily in the right order. Hey! So, thanks very much for watching. I hope this has been informative. Until next time, be cool.